Hi, I'm Pastor Philip, and this is Bible Stories from the Gospel of John. And we're just going to take some time to look today at an incredible story in John chapter 9 about the blind man. Now remember, back in Jesus' day, this is 2,000 years ago, there were different power players, as it were. One of the key leaders in the Jewish culture was called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, they were literally Jewish lawyers. Remember, the Jews followed the law, meaning the first 5 books of the Bible. And the first 5 books of the Bible were written by a guy named Moses. So God had Moses write the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And those books are what the rules or the laws of the Jewish people in which they hold. And so the lawyers were the ones, the Pharisees were the ones who completely understood the law, and they helped hold the people accountable to doing and obeying those laws. Now, the truth of it is not only did they have these laws, which were written in the Bible, but they'd also had over 500 other laws that they made up on their own. Laws that they actually, by the time you get to Jesus' day, which is 1,500 years after Moses, and these guys had written quite a few new laws, and they kind of saw them as on the same level as God's law, even though they kind of added to it. They were also the gatekeepers. So, we live in a very free society. We can kind of move wherever we want to move to and do what we want to do. But these people were a little bit more tribal. They lived in certain towns, they lived in certain communities, and then inside of that town or community, you'd have to get permission from the leadership of that town in order to do things. We're going to bump into this guy who's a blind man, who's a beggar. And that means he was kind of an outcast from society. And we're going to find out later that Jesus is going to heal him. But in order for this man to get kind of the right to be in society, he has to get permission from the Pharisees to come back in. You're going to see how that plays and how that plays out. One of the things that's really interesting about the Bible is though this, especially the New Testament, written 2,000 years ago, is very appropriate for today. Very, very appropriate for today. So if you would turn with me into your Bibles to John chapter 9, I'm going to do some reading and I'm going to talk about the things that we're discovering as we go along the way. So in John 9, verse 1, it says, as he was passing by, he saw a blind man from birth. So Jesus, now he was with his disciples. They had just done all kinds of other miracles. And now he's passing by and he sees a blind man born from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Wow. Okay, this is a really great question. They're asking, why is this guy born blind? And their immediate conclusion was, someone must have sinned in order for this man to be born blind. Either it was him or it was his parents. Now that's interesting. We call this retribution theology. It's kind of what Job's friends were having a problem with. Way back in the Old Testament, you find this story of a guy named Job. And all of his friends come to mourn the incredible losses that he had. He lost all of his stuff. He lost all of his family. And the conclusion that his friends had was the reason why it happened is Job must have done something wrong. But actually, we read the book of Job, that wasn't what happened. He didn't do anything wrong. And here we find that this same kind of thinking still is pervasive today. You find it in other different types of religions. You see it in the yin and the yang, or you call it karma. People would say that you reap what you sow. And there is some general proof of property for that to be true. But the very fact that someone was born blind doesn't mean that someone did something wrong for that to happen. And we're going to discover that Jesus doesn't go along with the disciples' thinking. And yet the disciples aren't the only ones who feel this way. So in verse 3, we pick it up. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Jesus answered, this came about so that God's work might be displayed in him. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one will work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, there's a lot of pieces to this right here that we could kind of lead into, but we just want to focus on one basic thought. Jesus was saying to them, you guys are wrong. Neither his father or he sinned in order for him to be born blind. This was actually something that God did. God actually allowed this to happen to this man so that his power might be on display. And we're going to see that lived out here in this situation. So we pick it up in verse 6. After he said these things, he spit on the ground and made some mud from the saliva and spread the mud on his eyes. Now you want to make sure you you pay attention, this sounds like a weird thing. Him spitting on the ground and making mud and then putting it on his eyes. That's going to be important in a few minutes. Verse 7, go, he said to him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which meant sent. So Jesus is going to ask this man who's blind with mud on his eyes to walk quite a distance to this other pool. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. Oh, that's pretty amazing. So now the man who was born blind, so we don't know how old he is, probably 30 years old, something like this. He's been blind his whole life. He meets Jesus on the road. Jesus puts mud on his eyes and asks him to go to a pool, which is a distance away, to go get washed. And the man comes back seeing, which is a complete miracle. And verse 8, his neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, isn't this the one who used to sit begging? Some said, he's the one. Others were saying, no, but it looks like him. And can you imagine? No one's ever been healed this way before. They've never seen anybody who's been born blind be healed like this. And so, of course, they're like, this doesn't make any sense. That can't be the same guy who sat on the street corner for 30 years begging. That must be a different guy. And that, we kind of laugh, we read the story. But the truth is, I think we would have been just as confounded as they were. And this is what we find in the text. And so he kept saying, no, I'm the one. So he's like, no, it's me. It's me, It's Fred. Remember me? Fred. Okay. So here's the guy trying to convince his friends and his neighbors that he's actually the guy who was born blind. He answered, the man called Jesus, verse 10. So they asked him, then how were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, go to Siloam and wash. So when I went and I washed, I received my sight. Wow. Exactly what he said. Jesus put mud on his eyes, he washed, he received his sight. Where is he now, they asked. I don't know, he said. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Jesus purposely had this guy move away from him before he received his healing, so he wasn't with Jesus when he received his healing. I'm going to find why that's important later on. So we find now in verse 13, they brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. Remember the Pharisees? These were the religious lawyers, okay? And they're the ones who kept the law. They knew the law, and they were the ones who were going to see if this blind man, who was an outcast from society, is allowed back in, if he legitimately was that man, and if he was actually now could see. So, verse 14, the day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. Yeah, a Sabbath. Now, to most of us who aren't Jewish, that doesn't really mean a whole lot. Way back in the old days, we used to have the blue laws on Sundays. We didn't do anything. But the Jewish people had a lot of laws, of rules around the Sabbath. God said to keep the Sabbath holy. He said to rest on the Sabbath. And so then the Pharisees and a bunch of other of Jewish leaders, historic leaders, had traditions where they basically limited the Sabbath to can only walk so far. You couldn't work on the Sabbath. And they defined what work was. And what we're going to discover is everything Jesus had this man do did not break God's law, but it definitely broke their laws. And their laws, they assumed, were God's laws. And this is going to put them in a very difficult place. So he goes to the Pharisees, and they asked, okay, how did he receive your sight? And so for the third time, we get to hear the story. The blind man says, he put mud on my eyes, he says, and I washed, and I can see. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. So some of the Pharisees are like, he doesn't keep our view of the Sabbath, and so that means he can't be from God. So we utterly dismiss it. But others were saying, how can a sinful man perform such signs? And this is going to be an important thought all the way through. Because in the Jewish mind, someone who could do a miracle is not someone who's just doing it out of their own strength. The only strength they could do a miracle from is from God. And so if a person's doing a miracle, that meant they must be from God or working for God to accomplish that. And that is going to put these guys in the Pharisaical world in a bit of a fight back and forth. And it says, and there was a division among them. So some were saying he's from God. Some were saying he can't be from God because he broke the Sabbath. So again, they asked in verse 17, the blind man, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? He's a prophet, he said. So the blind man says, he's a prophet. Now that could mean a lot of things. But one of the primary things it does mean is this guy is a voice from God. God is working through him. And so this guy is saying he's from God. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe this about him. That was, he was blind and received his sight. So they couldn't even believe that this mustn't have happened. Their only excuse for why Jesus couldn't have healed the guy was it wasn't the guy at all. He never got healed, so they didn't even believe it until they summoned the parents of the one who had received his sight. So this is going to be interesting. Now the Pharisees are going to try to prove that this was the guy born blind, and they're going to bring his parents in. And you would think, you think about this, your son or daughter has been some kind of malady, like they were born with a bad leg or whatever, and they're born blind, like this guy. And they were like this for 30 years, and now somebody comes into town and heals your son or daughter. How are you going to feel about that? I know I would be like over the moon, wanting to know who this guy was, wanting to thank him, and giving an opportunity to give him all the praise and kudos I can give him, because that's quite the thing that happened. But let's see what happens with these parents, okay? So it says here, they brought the parents in, verse 19. They asked them, is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How then does he now see? So, verse 20, we know this is our son and that he was born blind. But his parents answered, but we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who opened his eyes. That's interesting, isn't it? Ask him, ask our son. He's of age. He will speak for himself. Can you imagine? They didn't know who healed their son. Of course they knew. And they wanted their son to actually have to give the answer. Why is this? Look at verse 22. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews. Can you imagine not being able to tell the truth because you're afraid what other people might do to you? I wonder if this is just something that only happened 2,000 years ago, or if there is social pressure even today of things we can or cannot do or say, because if we do, our society will push us out or we might lose access to things. Isn't that interesting? We wear different clothes, things look different, we drive cars now, but the truth is human nature and human behavior amongst each other hasn't changed. There are still power brokers then, and there are still power brokers today. There are politically correct things you can and cannot say today, just like there was back then, because the power brokers that be will do something to you, take something away from you, intimidate you from actually telling the truth. And what we see here is the parents were afraid to tell the truth because they didn't want to lose their status in their society. They were more concerned about keeping in the good books with the Pharisees than they were about really taking care of the one who helped their son. Verse 22, his parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him, meaning Jesus, as the Christ or the Messiah, he'd be banned from the synagogue, which meant they'd be put out of all the social realities of that day. This is why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So a second time they summoned the man who had been born blind and told him, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. That's interesting, isn't it? They set the guy up. They bring him in now. This is the third time they brought the guy in, and now they're talking to him. And they're like, give glory to God. We know that this guy who healed you is a sinner. Well, they're setting the guy up like like they want him to agree with them. He answered, whether or not he's a sinner, verse 25, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, and now I can see. So they want to call Jesus a sinner because he didn't keep the Sabbath the way they thought the Sabbath should be kept. But the truth was, Jesus did something that only God could do. He healed a man who was born blind. And this is what this guy's like. You want to call him a sinner? I don't know about that. What I do know, that stuff, I don't know. What I do know is that I was blind, but now I see. So they said, then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Verse 26. They've asked him, now this is like the fourth time he's had to tell this story. He's like, verse 27, I already told you, he said. You didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you? So he gets a little snarky here. He's like, you guys seem very interested in making me tell this story like the fourth time. Do you want to be his disciple? Of course, the Pharisees didn't want to be Jesus' disciple. They wanted to get rid of Jesus because you think about it. If the Pharisees actually agreed with Jesus, then what about all of the stuff that Jesus was saying that was contrary to what they said? If Jesus became the authority, if Jesus was the one that people trusted in, well, then how would they be the power brokers? And how would their words be true? They'd lose their status, their resources, and they would just lose their standing in the culture. And they weren't willing to risk all that. What they needed to do is they needed to find a way to get rid of Jesus because he was just in the way. He was inconvenient for them. So they ridiculed him. You're this man's disciples, but we are Moses' disciples, verse 29. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he's from. Now that's interesting, isn't it? These guys are now putting their whole life on, we follow Moses, and we follow these first 5 books of the Bible. Moses wrote those, and we're all about keeping the law, and we know what we believe. Yet this man who healed him, born blind. Wow, that's incredible. Verse 30, this is what the blind man said. This is an amazing thing, the man told him. You don't know where he's from. You don't know where this guy's from, yet he opened my eyes. It's like the very proof is right here. We know that God does not listen to sinners, verse 31. But if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. We see in all of the Old Testament, you have incredible prophets like Elijah and all these other guys that come through, and they've never had a story of someone born blind that they healed. That hadn't happened. That hadn't happened. No one has ever done this before. And so now here is this man who was born blind, been begging for 30 years. They can't deny he was born blind. They can't deny that this miracle happened. And now they're stuck with the reality of the truth of the fact. The only one who could do this is God. And if this man was the one who God used to do it, this man must be from God. And this is a very difficult truth that they weren't really willing to stomach. It's a powerful, powerful truth. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything. Wow. Now you would think that these PhD level scholars, right, who knew their Bible, their law, back and forth, and they could do anything. They've been trained by the best. They could outwit, they could out-argue, they could come up with the best arguments to take care of this man who was born blind. They could demolish them with their arguments. No, because when you're fighting against the truth, your arguments no longer win, especially when they're not in the truth. And so this man's simple argument that I was blind but now I see destroyed any argument they could put on the table. So instead of civilly dealing with this man and dealing with him in a, let's argue the truth of this, look what they do. Here we find him in verse 34. You were born entirely in sin, they replied, and you are trying to teach us? Then they threw him out. Wow, okay. Great closing argument, guys. Way to get that done. And what did they say? You were born entirely in sin. Remember what the disciples said in the beginning of the story in John 9? That same mindset, what we call retribution theology, they perceived because he was born blind, he must have done something terrible. But that wasn't what happened. God had allowed him to be born blind, even for this very moment, for those Pharisees to have to face the truth that Jesus was really from God and had the power of God to do something only God could do, which was heal this man who was born blind. Their recourse, kick the guy out because they couldn't deal with him anymore. There's so much that we can learn from this story, but we really want to focus on who is Jesus? What is he all about? And is it true today, like it was back then, that there are gatekeepers, there are people who really either directly or indirectly don't really want you dealing with the truth or telling the truth about who Jesus is? And if you do, somehow now you're going to be getting a different grade on your paper or don't get that promotion at work or, yeah, we find social pressure is true today as it was back then. It looks different. They have different names. But here's what the blind man said. I was once blind, but now I see. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you learned a lot.